So I'm going to start with the first question.
Yeah.
So the survey that we mentioned, Eurofound conducted, it explores the different economic and social challenges Europe faces at the moment, and also how different countries and different groups of people are affected. So my question is, what do you think are the biggest social and economic challenges facing us in a post-COVID-19 Europe?
Yeah. Yes, well, you're right. It will have an extraordinary impact on not only Europe, of course, but the rest of the world. And the idea behind this survey was that we would reach out to Europeans and we would ask them in the moment. So essentially the first phase of the survey took place in April, when most countries across the European Union were in lockdown. And the idea was that we would ask people across Europe what they felt about their situation in the sort of immediate impact of the crisis. We looked at three key areas: well-being, we looked at work and how Europeans were dealing with work and the new implementation of telework, living conditions, and then of course their financial situation. We looked at that in the first phase. We closed it off in April, the end of April. And we are currently we've just closed the second phase, where we were looking at sort of a follow-on from that to see how people were emerging, if you like. We thought at that time it would be a second phase when we were emerging. It looks like this is going to be going on longer than any of us had actually imagined. So clearly the impact of that will also be more difficult for people to manage. But I mean, what we did find was that things were not good. As you can imagine, things were not good. And I think there was no doubt that people were aware of the impact it was having on their well-being. There was a huge decrease in well-being across the European Union. People were indicating levels of depression and high levels of loneliness. There were very low levels of optimism, and there was very low level of trust in the European Union and also in national governments. And that has an impact, as you can imagine, in an ongoing way on how people feel about that, how they engage with society. And that will have an impact into the longer term, not least because, of course, the economic situation is worsening. People have greater concerns about their financial future because they were experiencing direct impact on their lives. There was a dramatic decrease in people's working time. Many people were furloughed, people lost their jobs, contracts were discontinued. And people felt that insecurity, and that feeling of insecurity has impacted on their well-being. So it was a very difficult situation that we found looking at the way people were interacting with the first impact of the crisis. And there was also, I think, in particular countries, we saw particular differences. And that was what was interesting, was that clearly in some countries, there were higher levels of reported loneliness or feelings of depression or anxiety than there were in others. And in other countries, there were reported levels of very low levels of resilience, for example, and high levels of tension. And low levels of life satisfaction. France, for example, was a country which really did come out quite starkly as indicating low levels of life satisfaction. So when it comes to, well, you know, how's that going to impact? I mean, clearly we're going to be looking also now into the next phase, because what we wanted to see was the immediate impact. Many people were very devastated in the immediate effects of the virus. But then, of course, there's the follow-on from that. There was some hope that in some cases we would see a recovery. It looks like we're going to be looking into a longer term. How do we deal with that is one of the issues that we're going to have to look at across the European Union, and how that's going to have an impact on people and their lives, their jobs, the economic situation. How do they work, for example, into the future? You know, we saw a huge increase in terms of how people are teleworking. And I think we will see a greater incidence of teleworking, and we will see people adapting to a new way of engaging in the labour market, which perhaps we saw to some degree before, when people were working slightly differently from what we would have been used to in terms of the traditional 9-to-5 office job. But this is a different ball game entirely. So in terms of how is it going to impact on us, we also have particular places where, particular countries where it's having an impact. I indicated there that we're looking at France, but for example, countries like Bulgaria and Greece have really high levels of feelings of insecurity there. And across, for example, in Denmark, and there's only 10% of people who are fearful for their financial future, whereas in Bulgaria it was 62%. So you can see there's a vast disparity there in terms of how people are feeling.
Interesting.